It is Thursday, and that means it's time yet again for Full Four's the most accurate podcast. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle, joined today by friend in life, John Paulsen, who has been away on vacation in Hawaii. How are you doing, Paulsen? Refreshed now?
Yeah, I was telling Sal before we came on that I'm ramping into regular life. I think I've completed my ramp up. Monday was a little rough, but
Mhm.
Hawaii is a whole nother whole other thing. So I'm ready to talk some football though.
To step away to Hawaii definitely creates a different reality. It's not like a typical go on a driving, like a road trip for 48 hours and then come back to your normal work schedule. You literally get to receive bliss for a week and then try to get back to reality, which is what you're in right now. But while you were away watching some beautiful sunsets and volcanoes, the NFL, I can assure you, kept moving. It refused to stop for me, unfortunately. And so, what I've done here for today, Paulson, is carefully curate a list of the top 10 veterans I believe could lose value post draft and just having a player of significant draft capital added behind them. I don't count typically fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh round guys as someone who's going to make an impact immediately, but I truly believe this list of 10 players may fall off the map. And really, I don't know what you're going to say. That's why I'm so excited about this because perhaps you know the list, but perhaps you have a different opinion that they won't fall off the map. And I want to start with Alan Lazard, who's currently going as the wide receiver 51 in best ball leagues right now, because we have a significant update. Sammy Watkins, even just added to this roster on a 1 year, $4 million contract. The Packers, as we know, double dip at the end of the first round. And so I'm curious if one receiver, I imagine Watkins takes two off the board, but would one rookie receiver and Watkins make you concerned about Alan Lazard moving forward?
Yeah, you could maybe say that this is a list of or this is a list of players that has lost value since the start of the podcast with Watkins being signed. Impacts Lazard a little bit. I think there's been this kind of narrative or this stream on Twitter of people saying that Lazard is, destined to be the Packers wide receiver one this year because Aaron Rodgers is so big on familiarity and he's familiar with Lazard and Cobb, and those two are who are going to get the targets. And I don't see it that way. I like Alan Lazard as a player. He's a good run blocker. He has had some big games when we needed it. As a Packer fan, at certain times, but he hasn't cracked 600 yards receiving in any season. He had 33 for 451 and 3 touchdowns in 2020. That was probably his best season. It was 10 games. He averaged 45 yards per game. And I think that's sort of what, in a good year, he's going to do for you as a wide receiver two for the Packers in that offense. And then I think Sammy Watkins, I don't think it necessarily takes two receivers off the table. As they have four first round picks and 2 second round picks. So I think there's a chance that they could still use two of those 4 picks on receivers. I think Watkins is an upside. Let's see how he's doing. It sounds like the deal's up to $4 million. It's probably incentive laden, depending on number of snaps, depending on number of games played, that kind of thing. Because that's his issue has been, staying healthy. And he's an interesting guy to add to this offense. If you're looking at maybe a first round rookie as the wide receiver 1, Lazard is the 2, Watkins and Cobb is the 3-4. That's not too bad. If you're hoping that one of Watkins and Cobb is available each week, they're both getting a little bit injury prone. So I just would like to put some cold water on the Lazard as going to be the wide receiver 1. I'd rather bet on a first day receiver. I might even bet on a second day receiver ahead of him in terms of targets. I think Rodgers is going to spread this ball around. It's going to be a very different offense. It's not going to be the Devonta Adams show. He's going to be running the plays as designed, going through his reads and throwing it to the open person. I don't think it's going to be fed to any one player, especially not Lazard.
I completely agree with you. And I keep coming back to the fact, not so much Sammy Watkins deterring me, but just that unless we believe Alan Lazard in hauling in all 8 of his touchdowns, a career high last year. And yes, as you mentioned, a career high in starts, a career high in raw snaps as well. But overall, to secure 9 of his red zone catches, turned those into 8 touchdowns, that's where he scored all of his touchdowns. Unless he's suddenly the next Adam Thielen and in line for a 5th-year breakout, I would be concerned. So right now, I think his ADP is just fine. I know a lot of sharp people who are reaching on it, and that's okay. But I do think the value, like I said, not for Sammy Watkins, but because a rookie is absolutely going to tank him, especially because a rookie likely would play on the boundary where he's playing, whereas Sammy Watkins we expect to be intermittently used or take over altogether for Randall Cobb in the slot. And so that's why I am shying away significantly from Allen Lazard. I want to talk about Devin Singletary as well, because he came on strong in the last 6 games in the postseason. The Bills used him as a workhorse. He averaged 17 carries per game in that stretch, but Buffalo is also making it known they're clearly in the market for explosiveness at the running back position. As we know, they made a run at J.D. McKissic as the receiving back before he had a change of heart and re-signing with Washington. And then they've also sneakily made top 30 visits with Isaiah Spiller and James Cook, as well as being infamously interested in making Breece Hall potentially the first running back off the board, which is important since Hall did average 27 catches per season in college, a la the J.D. McKissic role. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts on where you were landing Singletary right now, since as it stands pre-draft, he is the RB 19, I believe, a low-end RB2. Let me double check that to make sure, but I believe it's 19.
Yeah, and I pulled the data, and I don't know if it's due to the super flex. I have him at running back 31, but maybe that's incorrect.
No, 29. I wrote that number
29,
down.
okay.
29,
So
so around
we're
that
probably
range.
looking at the same stuff. That's interesting information in terms of the visits and what they're, because if you look at this backfield and you just look at the depth chart, it looks fine. Like they don't look like a running back is a big need. Singletary was good for them. He's 4.6 yards per carry. Not that that's the greatest stat in the world, but he's a dual threat type guy. He averaged 17 touches per game in his final 9 games. And they've got Zach Moss there, who's not bad. And they added Duke Johnson, who had a good finish and is, every time I talk about Duke Johnson, I have to mention that he's the all-time leading rusher at the University of Miami. Mm-hmm. So, in a vacuum, I wouldn't think that they'd be looking at running back as a priority, but, if they're making these, having these invites and doing these visits with these high-end running backs, then yes, day 1 or day 2 running back is going to affect his stock. And it does indicate that they're not, 100% sold on him being a bell cow. But you look at what they did in the last season, they really fed him. And if he comes out of this and they don't draft a running back in, Thursday or Friday, then I think he's going to be a phenomenal value at, RB 29, RB 31.
I think it would be my biggest riser post-draft, honestly, if he somehow escapes the draft without a running back behind him, especially one on day 1 and day 2. We know they're in the market. I already mentioned for explosiveness, but the fact that even in giving him bell cow usage, that only 8% of his runs went for 10 plus yards, like he was a voluminous running back for fantasy. He was not an explosive running back for fantasy. So if now we're chopping those carries in half or just taking them away altogether and also saying you're not going to have the third down option because that's going to go to a James Cook or Breece Hall, that's extremely concerning. So I think he's on a lifeline in fantasy, and this is the one that we should all be monitoring the closest ahead of the draft, because it will, like Myles Gaskin, just tank significantly.
Yeah, and the thing about him that sort of props him up is his receiving yards and his catches. I mean, 46 and last year, 51 catches a year before. So if they do bring in a pass catching back specifically, that's problematic.
Washington has also surprisingly been to the market for a wide receiver at number 11, in particular, Chris Olave. I mentioned it last week on the podcast with Field Yates, but Josh Norris pointed out that Ron Rivera, since 2011, had only made 3 personal visits with the Panthers, 2 pro days, and he happened to make one just this past week with Washington to Ohio State's pro day, and then did not ask for a private interview with Garrett Wilson. He instead asked for a private interview with Chris Olave. So if we're connecting the dots, we think it's Olave added to Scott Turner's offense. The issue for me, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it, is that we are now also taking these targets and saying, how much of an upgrade is Carson Wentz over Kyle Allen? Because you can't argue an upgrade, but really, how much of an upgrade do we think that is?
So in preparation for this, I was looking at Carson Wentz, and I think that for for Terry McLaurin, it's his deep ball is key. And Wentz was actually pretty good last year with the deep ball. His passing was better than Heineke's. He had 47.5% adjusted completion percentage at PFF on deep ball attempts. That was the 12th best amongst qualified quarterbacks last year, which is an upgrade. So a 90.7 passing grade on those passes. So as bad as the narrative is on Wentz, and he was bad at times, he does throw a pretty good deep ball, and he did well last year in that regard. So I think that does help McLaurin. And then the other so let's say this is a net gain for him with Wentz. I mean, even if it's not a huge net gain, it's a net gain. If they do take a first round receiver, it's problematic again. I mean, they are getting Curtis Samuel back. So I'm looking at this with Diami Brown and some other players there. They don't have a major need at receiver, in my opinion. So, but as you mentioned, the tea leaves here are they're gonna take somebody early. So the question is the pie going to grow big enough to offset, adding a top 10 or top 12, receiver that go early in the first round? It's going to be tough to have McLaurin ranked, where I had him ranked last year, or looking at him as low under wide receiver 1. He'd probably be in the wide receiver 2 ranks. I still think I'm a big fan of his game. But with Carson Wentz at the quarterback position, you got Logan Thomas, you got pass catching running backs there. It's just a lot of mouths to feed if you're adding an Olave to the offense.
For McLaurin's dynasty value, it's encouraging that we know Carson Wentz has no more guaranteed money after this year. He's essentially a veteran stopgap until they figure out what to do at quarterback. So we are hanging on to Terry McLaurin. But I do worry, because I recall personally how frustrating it was to see Michael Pittman weekly end up as the wide receiver 26 in fantasy points per game. Now, from Wentz, that was still better than McLaurin's wide receiver 32 ranking in fantasy points per game from Kyle Allen. So we are expecting a little bit of an upgrade. I just want to make sure that I'm not drastically getting too high on that upgrade. And right now, with a wide receiver 20 ADP, it seems like people are still somewhat high. So low-end wide receiver 2, you are rolling the dice a bit, but I think I'd prefer to wait just a hair longer. Are you more in line of thinking the deep ball rate and just McLaurin's catching success is going to land him like as a mid wide receiver 2? Is that where you would reach for him? Or are you comfortable waiting until low-end wide receiver 3?
Yeah, I'd like this is why we're talking about this before the draft. I would like to see what happens in the draft. I think that sounds pricey given what they're doing and the personal interview with Olave and all the rumors that they're going to draft a running back or draft a receiver early in the first round. That just kind of throws his value up in the air a little bit. I mean, you're looking at a similar quarterback, maybe a little bit better, but is the fantasy pie big enough to support the McLaurin? He was 32 last year, as you mentioned. How much higher is that ceiling there with Wentz, and then adding in a talented rookie?
Although I hate the player, I ultimately hate the ADP, so I don't mind missing the boat, especially in these next couple of weeks, on McLaurin, assuming they draft a wide receiver. That'll obviously change post-draft, and we'll have something else to talk about. A player I'm not missing the boat on is Marquez Valdes-Scantling with his current wide receiver 53 ADP on Underdog, because even though the Chiefs are rumored to add a receiver with one of their 2 picks to end the first round, I don't know how many will even be available that can do what MVS does on the outside, like be very successful at separating downfield and getting open from deep targets for Patrick Mahomes. Right now, the Chiefs are rumored to add someone like a Christian Watson, George Pickens at the end, David Bell. And if you listen to anyone who knows about their profiles, like these are not players we should really be excited about, at least for year one, because it's a lot of raw talent that needs to be put together in the right scheme and fit. Mahomes makes everyone better, but I'm curious on your thoughts on MVS at his current going rate.
I think you mentioned Watson, who's a really interesting prospect, but probably not going to help right away year one or early year one. Certainly for Valdes-Scantling and Juju and McCole Hardman, it'd be better if they don't draft a receiver early. But the Chiefs have been really active in trying to acquire people, even though they traded away Tyreek Hill. They've been seemingly trying to rope in some free agents, or have been talking about it in the draft as well. So Valdes-Scantling is not nearly as good of a route runner as Tyreek Hill, but he can replace some of the deep ball stuff that Tyreek is able to do really well. They're both super fast, and Valdes-Scantling is super fast and he's pretty big. And I think he's better than McCole Hardman. McCole Hardman might take a step forward this year, but I'm sort of tired of waiting. He couldn't really beat out Demarcus Robinson, Byron Pringle last year. So I think he's the clear 3 right now. And you're looking at Juju as probably the leading target getter at the receiver position, with Kelsey obviously eating a lot of targets. And then Valdes-Scantling working in for like 5 to 7 targets with, a lot of air yards. It was interesting to see Matt Harmon's reception perception profile on Valdes-Scantling, and it basically looked good when he was going deep, and not a lot of else, going well for him. I thought he improved this last year specifically, and the big thing I think in the end result was that he didn't have a single drop this year, and this has been something that has plagued him all his career, and he didn't have a drop this last year, so he cleaned that up. And he did have some big games. They were always looking for him, and they were always dialing up some deep shots for him. And I noticed a lot of times where he's running free, beat his man, and then Rodgers misses him by a few yards. And I don't know if it's Valdes-Scantling's fault or if it's the back-to-back MVP's fault, but they were not connecting deep consistently. And that's been something that's been going on since MVS landed in Green Bay. So that'll be interesting to see if that changes with Mahomes, if they have a better rapport or better ability to connect deep. But he is always open when he goes deep. I mean, not always, but very frequently open. He can really fly, and he's big as well. So if he shows decent hands, he's going to have some big games. And he's another one of these better in best ball type guys where you're going to enjoy those big games from him. If you draft him in best ball, you don't have to worry about starting him every week.
I always talk about archetypes of a player of his profile, and that we want the deep targets, right? We want Chase Claypool, but the issue is when you're getting 3 deep targets per game or 3 targets per game, that's different than being a deep player like James Washington, like MVS, and then suddenly getting 7 to 9 targets per game, because now we're adding in the high upside in those deep targets combined with volume. That's money right there. And so I want to be ahead of this, thinking that if they add one of these players, the Chiefs, that they're rumored to grab, I don't think they'll dent MVS's role in this offense. And so that's where I'm leaning right now. I believe we should be ahead of him. A player of opposite profile, and it's interesting because right now, with Cordarrelle Patterson and the Falcons, I'm curious to get your thoughts, because the Falcons are rumored, for one, to draft a quarterback. They're all over the board because they need help all over the place. I'm not of the belief that they're going to add a quarterback with the number 8 pick, if only because I think in restructuring Matt Ryan's contract before he was dealt, I think that was a message they were trying to tell us, that they weren't happy with this class, and they were happy to keep him until the Colts persuaded them to send him along. But I do think they're looking for the next Calvin Ridley replacement, knowing they had a deal in place with the Eagles before everyone backed out because Ridley's year-long suspension came down. And if that's the case, if they add a receiver here, a Garrett Wilson, a Chris Olave, then I'm curious to get your thoughts on Cordarrelle Patterson, because we got rugged on him last year, and that in his first 8 games, 9 carries and 6 targets. That's what we want from our RB2, our wide receiver 2s. We want that type of dream Deebo Samuel usage, and the carries and the targets, voluminous across the board. But then when he came back from injury, across his last 7 games, 11 carries and 3 targets. And so that, as a between the tackles grinder who sometimes mixes in on 3rd down, that's not what we want from our RB2s, because the floor is significantly lower. And so where will you be drafting Cordarrelle Patterson if they happen to add a wide receiver?
That's an interesting question, because I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting a question about them adding a running back, because I think that's probably the bigger. I mean, I think his receiving role is probably safe-ish. I think the issue is, do they draft a first, second down grinder, because he's not. You don't want to run him up the middle 10 times. And Mike Davis is.
When they did do that, when they turned him into the between the tackles grinder, he was obviously bad at it, because that's not what he does. Remember, the Bears tried that for 2 years, and that's not what he does well at all.
Yeah, you want to use him sparingly there, and then a lot as a receiver, and then get him outside if you can. And so I think ideally he gets into a committee where there's a between the tackles grinder type on first and second down, taking some of those carries, and then you're bringing him in on high leverage stuff in the red zone, because they did do that last year. They brought him in the red zone, and he was pretty adept at scoring touchdowns as well. So that was the weird thing is, towards the end of the season, his snaps started to dry up, and I don't know if they were just kind of ramping down the season, not wanting to overdo it with them. I don't know when they were out of the playoff hunt. It seems like they were in it for longer than it seemed. But I wouldn't be that worried. There are so many targets up for grabs in Atlanta, and the receiver position is so desperate. I mean, they're just adding wide receiver 3-4 types, Bird and Hodge, I think, and they just have a bunch of depth there and no stud. That with Pitts as the primary pass catcher right now, if they added a bona fide wide receiver 1, I don't know that would kill Patterson. I think I'm more worried about a 3-down back that might just push him off the field completely. They did give him a pretty good 2-year deal, like $5 million a year. It's it's starter money, so I think they do have a plan in mind for him. And in a PPR format, and you're looking at him in the 5th, 6th round, that's not bad at all.
Let's take a quick timeout, and we'll be right back with our last 5 players. Right now, if you sign up at Underdog as a new subscriber, not only will you receive a free pro subscription to 4for4 with access to all of our off-season content, including our around-the-clock Discord conversations, Underdog will also match your deposit up to $100 by 100%. Literally mirror it. And there are no catches. Just download the Underdog app, use the promo code 4for4 when depositing. That's the number 4, word, the number again, and presto. A 2-part question as we enter the final term here, and that's because DeAndre Hopkins right now being treated as a low-end wide receiver 1 despite Christian Kirk's departure, wide receiver 12 ADP on Underdog. And this is a 2-part question because NFL Network's Mike Garafolo reports the Cardinals have yet to make a contract offer to Kyler Murray, whose agent, Eric Burkhart, informed the organization weeks ago he was pulling his opening proposal off the table altogether. We also know on Thursday afternoon, A.J. Green was re-signed to a 1-year deal after leading the team with 17 red zone targets and 11 opportunities inside the 10. All those money targets we want to go elsewhere to DeAndre Hopkins or Rondale Moore, who you're excited about. So basically what I want to ask, since we also know that the Cardinals are looking at offensive skill players, wide receiver in particular, with the 21st or in the middle of the 20s in the first round, what would another receiver being added to this roster do for DeAndre Hopkins, Rondale Moore for you? Would it matter at all? And does AJ Green's addition, re-signing, also tank Rondale Moore or Hopkins for you?
In 2020, Hopkins averaged 10 targets per game, and that's the sort of usage you want for him. And then last year that dropped to 6.4 targets per game. And I was catching some flack early in the season for having him ranked lower than my peers. And why isn't Hopkins being ranked as a wide receiver 1? Well, the volume just wasn't there. The targets weren't there. They were spreading the ball around. Green got some. Rondale Moore even came in and got some. Christian Kirk was getting quite a few. They were throwing to the tight ends fairly consistently, whether it was Max Williams early or Zach Ertz later on in the year. And Hopkins' role just wasn't there. I mean, his targets dropped 35%. That's bad. I think heading into this question prior to the Green signing, I was starting to think that Hopkins was probably in line for a bounce back year, because you're looking at him as the number 1 receiver there, clearly, with Rondale Moore as possibly the 2, and Wesley maybe as the 3, and Ertz as the tight end who's getting 5 to 7 targets per game. But now you're adding Green back in, and as you mentioned, he was very big in the red zone for them. So it's starting to, if they also draft a receiver, it's starting to look bad and looking like Hopkins is back in that mid to low range wide receiver 2 type. I think there is some benefit here that he could be fully healthy again and back to his usual productive self in the targets he's given. But, that looks like the days of him getting double-digit targets per game are maybe gone at this point with Green coming back and potentially a rookie added as well.
If they were to add someone like Treylon Burks, an exciting rookie for us anyways, fantasy-wise, and also that we know can be a gadget player if they choose to use him like that, would that ruin the Rondale Moore steam for you, or are you still a believer right now?
Well, Rondale doesn't do or hasn't done much downfield, and
Right.
looking
That
at
1.7 A dot is not helpful for fantasy.
and and I like Matt Harmon's work, and you look at his rookie profile, and it's just he's a guy that's going to get the ball around line of scrimmage and try to make something happen, and so it sort of depends on how much he's on the field. If he's able to play and he's sort of a quote unquote starter, which now with Greenback, I don't know that you can really count on that. Because they like Wesley as well, and that they bring him in and they use Rondale when he's on the field. I think the fact that Kirk is out of the way, because Kirk played so much in the slot, that Moore's production there, role there could grow quite a bit. But with Greenback, you're starting to it takes a hit on his upside, I think. So now we're going into the draft, and he might add another receiver that would. But I know they really like Rondale, so. Mm-hmm. I don't know that, with Greenback, they're going to be really targeting a receiver in the first 2 days. And if they don't, then I think his role's fairly safe. I mean, I think he probably plays 60, 70% of the snaps. And that could lead to some pretty good games for him, because they do use him when he's on the field.
I agree. I'm still very high on Rondale Moore. And re-signing AJ Green, I immediately ran to update our available targets and air yards tracker. And the Cardinals did lose significant vacated targets, right? Because they re-signed AJ Green from last year's production. Thus, they have the 16th middle of the pack wide receiver targets missing from last year, 103 total, which is essentially Christian Kirk's volume. And so we are hoping, for better or worse, that Cliff Kingsbury stays true to his word and will literally plop Rondale Moore in the exact spot, the slot that Christian Kirk was used last year. And they're just going to run him like that. And that's something, because I know the type of ceiling and profile that Moore has, I still want to bank on. And if it comes back to screw me, so be it, because I want to be ahead on players with his explosiveness. Also, with the Cardinals, is that they could be adding a running back day one or perhaps even day two. Both Breece Hall and James Cook have been rumored. They did re-sign Jonathan Ward to a one-year deal. I know people in Underdog are also excited about Benjamin as like a very last-round pick, and I've spent dumber picks on players other than Benjamin, so it's no big deal. Your last-round pick should just make you happy. I don't care who it is. But at the same time, like the fact James Conner, 20 touches, 5 targets per game last year, and 5 starts without Chase Edmonds, a high draft capital running back, may make us worry, since Connor's ADP has finally surged to RB18 overall. Started out low. It's now settling where it should be. So what are your thoughts if the Cardinals were to add a running back behind James Conner?
Well, I think if they don't, he's undervalued there. And I think that's why he's sitting there in the RB2 rankings, is people think that they're going to add somebody. Again, this is where I have a tough time separating what teams should do and what teams will do. And I don't think that the Cardinals should be using a premium pick on a running back. I think Conner's plenty capable, and there are guys that can come in and fill in if necessary. But if they do, if they get a premium running back in, and they're going to use them like they used Edmonds and Conner when they were together last year, then Conner is sort of devolving into, the primary carry guy, the primary goal line back, and, not getting a whole lot of third down usage. Receptions decrease as well if they bring in a pass catcher, because that's what basically Edmonds was doing last year. And when they were both healthy, Conner's upside was basically in his touchdowns, and he scored a lot of touchdowns last year. So we should sort of see who they bring in and the skill set that they bring in. And if it's a pass catcher, then we might be back to where we were last year.
I'm going to stay strong and overweight on Conner. Conner, Leonard Fournette, and Cam Akers are still at 3 running backs. I want to make sure I keep piling on until ADP catches up with what I believe is their correct number. And right now, in my opinion, they're still behind on that. Moving on to the Patriots, we don't have to talk about the Cardinals, fortunately, anymore. We're now talking about Patriots wide receivers, which I'm sure you were very confused about, because I put Jakobi Meyers in the list for you to discuss. And it's more about the Patriots being involved. Field Yates even hinted to it on last week's show when we discussed draft rumors. He thinks they still go skill player after the DeVonta Parker trade, since all these big money deals they did in offseason last year, they basically structured Kendrick Bourne, Nelson Aguilar Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith to be done in 2 to 3 years so they could void the contracts and get out of it. So there is room to allow a raw green talent to grow behind Parker and in that offense with Mac Jones this year. And so from a stance on whether or not they draft a rookie, like, what do you think about Jakobi Meyers and his 2 career touchdowns since they did add DeVonta Parker?
Parker coming in there, I think hurts Meyers and Bourne. I mean, I think that's, but you're kind of wondering as you head into the next season, like they're going to have to add somebody, whether it's in the draft or, free agent, probably. I mean, they're probably not going to go into the season with Meyers, Bourne, and Aguilar again. But when you look at the 4 guys they have, Meyers, Parker, Bourne, and Aguilar, they're kind of similarly talented, similarly as far as fantasy production, about the same. You kind of look at them as 40 to 60 yard guys, and they have different skill sets. Certainly, Aguilar thrived in a deep role for the Raiders a couple seasons ago, and Meyers just doesn't score touchdowns, and Bourne is kind of a touchdown maker when they do use him, but he sees like 4 to 5 targets a game. So so I think this is another team that could go into the season and not really do anything else at the receiver position. They have 4 pretty good guys, and but if they do, they've had bad luck drafting receivers early, and I don't know if they're going to spend a high pick or a lot of draft capital on one. I don't know. But they probably want to support Mac Jones and give him a stud to grow with. And if you're talking about somebody that can kind of grow, you're probably thinking somebody that's a little bit raw, and he's probably going to have a tough time getting on the field ahead of these guys who have experience, and 3 of them have experience in the offense and all that. So we'll see who they add. But again, this is a team where I don't know that they're going to necessarily go out and spend that draft capital on the receiver unless, they feel like they have to get him a Randy Moss type, or, not that exists in this draft, but, a stud receiver to kind of grow with Mac Jones.
DeVonta Parker at least adds the red zone presence wanted from N'Keal Harry this entire time. Like, that's where I keep coming back to Parker. But overall, I've even though he has schooled Stephon Gilmore from time to time and their matchups between the Dolphins and Patriots games, I'm still have never been really a Parker, not a believer, but he got his large extension from 8 games, a stretch with Ryan Fitzpatrick, whenever Preston Williams was injured his rookie year. Until the time Preston Williams got injured that year, Williams actually led Parker in targets on the team per game, because Williams was genuinely becoming the better player, and then not as an explosive player who actually needed all of his speed. That torn ACL's rookie year just tanked his career from there. And so I still worry about Parker, but will they feed him in the red zone and then thus he delivers fantasy points for it? Sure, but I still don't mind being behind him on ADP. Someone I don't know, though, I need to get your opinion on DeVonta Smith, because the Eagles, with one of their 2 picks in the first round, mid-first, I believe they're definitely adding wide receiver. Where they go from there, who knows? I think still cornerback. But if they add a wide receiver, it was hard enough, recall, starting DeVonta Smith in a run-first offense from Jalen Hurts' downfield inaccuracy. So, what do we do if we're adding another receiver, strong receiver in the first round, to the mix, and then saying, one of you have to survive Jalen Hurts' throwing?
Yeah, I looked at his ADP, and he's, the data that I saw, wide receiver 29 right now. He's ahead of Marquise Brown and Amon-Ra St. Brown, which is surprising. Adam Thielen, which is surprising. I think I like DeVonta Smith a lot. I think he's a really good route runner, really good receiver. But as you mentioned, he's paired with kind of a running quarterback, and he needs to improve that quarterback play for him to really take off. And I think Smith's second season, he's going to improve. He's going to be better. But if you're adding a day 1 type receiver, that's trouble. How big is the fantasy pie? And you've got Dallas Goedert as well. Quez Watkins is not bad at all. He's probably going to be the 3rd receiver there. Seems like they're giving up on Jalen Reagor. So it certainly depends on who that is, how raw they are, how pro ready they are, because if they're out there garnering targets in sort of a run heavy offense where the quarterback also takes off and runs a lot, it's just not going to be enough fantasy points available for DeVonta Smith to return that, solid wide receiver 3 value.
It's also frustrating because what they're doing. They're adding another elite receiver to the mix, getting ready for the quarterback of the future they draft next year. And so, like, even when we have these numbers sifted and figured out, it doesn't matter at all because then they're just going to change quarterbacks and get someone from next year's class. And finally, I want to end with Corey Davis because right now there is a lot going on among the Jets receivers. We know Jameson Crowder left to the Bills, and we also know Braxton Berrios, so they re-signed for good money, $12 million. Averaged 7.9 targets per game in the few starts he made without Crowder last year. But at the same time, the Jets have been hard in the wide receiver market, reportedly trying to trade for Deebo Samuel, A.J. Brown. They were on Tyreek Hill as well. They have Jameson Williams, another speedster that fits the wide back usage that Salah, McDaniel all get from the Shanahan tree, and just wanting to add an elite athlete that can add yak to the offense. So Jameson Williams, number 1 on their board. They'll have a chance to draft him at number 4, maybe number 10. But overall, like, they are trying very clearly to add a receiver with one of their first 2 picks at number 4 and number 10. So what happens to you? I wrote Corey Davis in the show notes, but Corey Davis is just an analogy for Jets receivers. Like, what happens here among all of these guys, including everyone's favorite Elijah Moore?
Yeah, I mean, I think Corey's the one that goes to the bench. So he's, if they bring in another stud type, I think they want Elijah Moore on the field. I think they actually want Berrios on the field as the slot receiver. And I think it's weird because Corey Davis, they just gave him a big contract, and he had a so-so year. He was
the
injured.
Same regime too, like the same coaching staff from the top down.
Yeah. So they identified something with him in his final season with Tennessee, and then brought him in for a lot of money. And then, I think he played 9 games, and he had some big games, and he had some games where he just flat out disappeared. So to see that they're in on all these big names, like really trying to make a splash. I mean, they're not just trying to add like a good receiver. They're trying to add like top-notch receivers. That tells me they want somebody to pair with Elijah Moore, Berrios running the slot, and then Davis goes to depth. And, maybe they can't count on him being healthy, and they want to use him, in a lower snap role based on what they saw last year. So I certainly, as much as the Jets have been involved in rumors with all these different teams and all these different receivers, I'd certainly expect them to target a receiver early. And that, that's why I'm just not on Davis at all. I think Moore is probably okay. Obviously it'd be better for him if they don't draft a receiver early, because then he can kind of work into that stud role. But if they do bring in another first-round receiver, then Moore, is going to take a little bit of a hit because it's still the Jets offense right now. Zach Wilson has some upside, but this is not like a high octane passing attack where he can support 2 or 3, fantasy receivers. And I think Berrios is going to end up being sort of as far as PPR is concerned, kind of a thorn in the side of fantasy owners who don't have him, or who have Moore, or who have whoever the rookie is that they draft, because he's going to be he gets open and he ends up producing when he's on the field. They hand him the ball sometimes, and even in the red zone, and he's just going to be that guy. It's like, oh, another Berrios touchdown, or another Berrios game where he had 12 fantasy points and kind of ate into the rest of the receivers' production.
So you are ranking them: Elijah Moore, Berrios, rookie Corey Davis.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rookie potentially could leapfrog Berrios, depending on who it is. But I think Berrios is just going to be. I'm just kind of predicting he's going to be kind of like Hunter Renfrow headache, where he's going to go undrafted, or he's going to be the wide receiver 5 or wide receiver 6, and he's going to end up having a pretty good PPR season. Could end up top 30, but it sort of depends on who they end up drafting and how well Zach Wilson progresses.
That's why Jameson Williams is so interesting with one of those picks, because after a January injury, we also know he probably won't be ready for week 1, or at least be brought along slowly, since long-term is in mind and having such high draft capital with him. But we will wait to see. Good luck to all 10 veterans who we just talked about, because now we put the curse on you. So until then, Paulsen, welcome back from Hawaii. We'll be back with you in a couple weeks. Next week, one more round of guests before the actual NFL draft takes place Thursday, April 28th. So until then, thanks everyone for tuning in. We will see you next time. Be on the lookout for my mock draft Friday morning at 44.com.